Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. And this week, our reading is centered around the book of 2 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians if you happen to be a president. And today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Sheryl Daughety. And our reading or our question comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. But since today is Monday, let me talk about the theme of 2 Corinthians first. So the theme of 2 Corinthians is generosity and reconciliation. And he is trying to get the people to reconcile to one another. This comes on the heels of 1 Corinthians, where he has instructed them to kick somebody out of the church. And there's a fair amount of belief that this letter was written in response to, okay, the guy has corrected the problem. He's no longer living in sin. Reconcile him back to the church. That seems to be one of the possibilities. And so in the letter, he not only talks about reconciliation, but he talks about generosity, the importance of giving generously, both to those in need, inside and outside the church. He encourages believers to give cheerfully and without being begged to give. They were divided over this conflict that had happened, the misunderstanding. He urges them to forgive one another, to be patient, kind, to seek to restore broken relationships. And so that's kind of the theme of the book. And today, verses 1 through 6, I'll just read. It says, chapter 3 says, "Are we beginning to praise ourselves again? Are we like others who need to bring you letters of recommendation, or who ask you to write such letters on their behalf? Surely not. The only letter of recommendation we need is you yourselves. Your lives are a letter written in our hearts. Everyone can read it and recognize our good work among you. Clearly, you are a letter from Christ showing the result of our ministry among you. This letter is written not with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It is carved not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. We are confident of all this because of our great trust in God through Christ. It is not that we think we are qualified to do anything on our own. Our qualification comes from God. He has enabled us to be ministers of His new covenant. This is a covenant not of written laws, but of the Spirit. The old written covenant ends in death, but under the new covenant, the Spirit gives life." So the question I have today is, how does God's calling recommend us to people? So he talks about the fact that they don't need a recommendation, that the work they've done of their calling is sufficient. So how does God's calling recommend us to people? And how do we know someone is called? How do we determine that?
You're asking about how we know somebody is called. I don't know how y'all feel about this, but I often feel like when I am in the presence of that person, they never have to say it.
Right.
That it's something you can sense in the person that they are and how well they're serving Christ, how well they're conveying the message that they were sent to convey.
Which kind of answers the first question: how does God's calling recommend us to people?
Mhm.
And you're saying you know it, you sense it, you see it. It's modeled, it's displayed. There's a lot of attributes to that. I will expand this a little bit and say it this way: people, their giftings, their talents, their calling of God is recognizable.
Mhm.
You see it. And I think oftentimes other people see it and recognize it perhaps even before the person does. But it becomes evident. You said you don't have to be around somebody very long when you start picking up, detecting, seeing, hearing, experiencing things that you begin to recognize God's calling. And it works both ways, back and forth. So I wonder how many times I've confused people.
What do you mean?
Meaning they say, "Oh, you're this or this," and then I'm around them, they're like, don't know how that works.
No.
Well, we have certain expectations of people who have certain jobs.
Certainly.
That we think, okay, if they do this, they can't be that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that really has anything to do with calling. It may have something to do with how well you live it out.
Mhm.
But have you tell me about a time, maybe, where you saw someone operating, but you did not believe that was their calling. And how did you respond?
Calling as in enablements of God, calling giftings.
Well,
strength.
let's say they believed they were called to be a pastor. They were called to
Okay.
be a worship
Yeah.
leader. They were called to do whatever. But
Yeah.
in your
Okay.
eyes, it did not appear
Okay.
that.
Yeah, there's a lot that come to my mind.
Maybe it's not me and Sheryl.
I won't use names
So
here.
let's talk about it later, Jay.
Yeah, that's right. But there have been numerous times, occasions through the years where I would be in a setting, most often a church setting, for instance, and somebody would go to the platform to sing a song because they were going to supposedly honor the Lord and bless the people, and it was far from that. And you knew they may have thought they had a calling toward that to be used in that area, but it was very evident this is not it. And that's sad because it's awkward, it's embarrassing, and I think it's you that have said at some point in time people have lied to them.
Yeah, because they had the guts. What I see happen in church more than not is people have the guts or the boldness to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so people will applaud them because they don't have that confidence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I tell my wife about American Idol. It is filled, the first few weeks are filled with people who grew up in church, and they were the only ones that had the guts to get up and sing. And so everybody told them how great they were. And they believed that they were great.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that happen. Like, I could give you some examples.
What's even sadder about that to me is the fact that they are really great at something else, but
That's
they
correct.
haven't been able to
Yes.
recognize it because
Yeah.
they've been focusing on this other thing.
Well, I can think of I can think of two pastors right now. They're both dead at this point, so
It don't matter.
They're both dead. One would have been in the top 3 worst preachers I've ever heard in my entire life.
You said? Wow.
Yeah, top 3. Horrible.
That's way up there.
Horrible. Oh yeah, because I've heard thousands. I mean, if you're making the top 10,
yes, bad.
He was in the top 3 worst preachers I've ever heard in my life. And I mean, he could take a text and then never say anything remotely close to related to the church, to that. But
I bet he was a good pastor.
This man, when it came to caring for people in need, was the ultimate sacrifice. Like, he would sit for hours in a hospital. He would sit for days with grieving families.
I think we see that often.
Yeah, and in what I would view from the outside, I thought, because like I would give a person like that is worth a lot of money to me, a lot of money, because I'm not gifted there. I don't grieve really well. I don't like sitting in hospitals. I don't visit really well, and so I can use my gift to speak and to lead and to galvanize and to cast vision. But in his mind, and the church creates a lot of this.
Well, that's what I was going to say. When I feel like we see a lot of this, I think that's why.
We believe, okay, if you're going to be the pastor, you got to do this and this.
Right.
And you might not be gifted to do this and this. The other one I saw, I wasn't as close to. The one I just talked about, I was fairly close to him. This man I knew more from a distance. And he had some similar gifts, but he had really great. He had a distinctive skill set, but he had a severe speech impediment. I mean, a severe speech impediment to the point that I'm not sure that people understood what he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But he had a gift that he could have operated in the church. But he felt like, okay, if I'm called, then I've got to preach or I've got to teach. There may have been a multitude of other things that he there were a multitude of other things that he could have done. And we put people in a box because, okay, if you're going to be the pastor, then you've got to do pastoral care, or you've got to visit hospitals, or you got to, and that alone can be a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
Just that alone can be a full-time job. And you don't have time to study. The worst ones that I see that bother me the most are those kind of people who never get to thrive in a place. Because I think about the man that I knew who's passed now. If he could have been on a staff on a church like ours, where the only thing he did was hospital visits and pastoral care and in-home visits and nursing homes, he would have thrived. And he wouldn't have had the weight of responsibility of finances and building buildings.
Not only would he have thrived, the church would have thrived
Exactly.
and benefited from his gift. I'm just curious, in those two examples you shared, were those small?
Very small.
And so there was probably
a severe lid.
And there was an expectation that,
we can't
one size fits all.
For all this.
And I hate it. And I see it happen frequently where I do believe people have a calling on their life, and I can see it. And I can think of two specific instances where I believed somebody was called to do something different than what they wanted to do. And had they listened, they would have been extremely successful, but we're no, I've got to do this. And it is, it's the natural order of things. It's almost like, okay, if I do this, then I've got to do this. It's like the salesman who feels like, okay, I've got to take the promotion and become a sales manager. No, you don't. Like, just because you're a good salesman don't make you a good sales manager. Just because you're a good youth pastor don't mean you're going to make a good senior pastor. Or just because you're a good, and we rank it out. We're not comfortable saying, okay, this is their calling, this is the lane, this is where I need to be. We make them feel like, okay, well, at 40, you should be pastoring your own church. Well, no, maybe you need to be working. And I see guys who've been extremely successful at it. Reggie Joyner, and what was the other guy's name? Sheryl, that helped start North Point with Andy Stanley. I can see his face now. I just can't think of his name. But anyway, they knew their lanes. And they focused on their lanes, and they let Andy do his thing, and they did their thing, and it was enormously successful. I think about Chris Hodges, who has a lot of influence on us, and Lane Schranz was employee number one there at Highlands. He's never gone to pastor a campus or plant his own church. He's like, this is the lane. This is the lane. I'm going to be the best I possibly can be. I'm never going to be the main communicator, but I'm gonna be the best I possibly can be. And if we're not careful, we box people in. And he says here, I don't need a letter of recommendation. You're proof enough. The difference that has happened in your life, and it's evident. The work that I've been able to do.
And I mean, and isn't that the truth though for any of our works? That the proof is in the people, it's in the results, in the sense, I'm not talking about numbers or dollars, but I'm talking about lives changed, stories. For instance, in your area of the growth in the kids and the development and those kids who stay in the church even as they grow and progress because of what they have learned. The recommendation is not in credentialing per se or years of experience in and of itself, but it is in the lives of those people and those kids who have gone through and progressed and grown and developed. And the same, with the church. And so in that regard, you can say, absolutely, I understand what he's saying. The recommendation, the validation is in the people. It's in what's happened.
You mentioned Sheryl. So if somebody asked me, how do you know Cheryl's doing a good job? I'd tell you three things. One, I don't hear parents complain. I don't hear volunteers complain. And the numbers go up. Those are three ways you measure. And the first two, see, people think that the numbers are most important to me. No, God, no. If your numbers are going up, but parents and volunteers are complaining to me regularly, I don't really care how many you got coming. Those are measures. You should be able to measure people's effectiveness and their calling by some of the work that they're doing.
When I was reading this ahead of time, that was what I started thinking about. I was like, okay, like what is my measurement? You know, how do I know? How do I know what
I just
fruit
gave you
is?
3.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now you know.
And look, in my role, that is the thing I look for in staff. I'm not looking for somebody to create more pain points for me. The reason I'm hiring you is because I got a pain point. I don't need you making more. You know, are you relieving my pain? You know, are you making my job easier? That's what, you can say this principle inside or outside the church, but there's a preacher who uses this phrase a lot. And he says, you'll make the most money when you solve somebody else's problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you can figure out how to solve their problem, that's your place of blessing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that people want their problem solved. You know, I remember Jerry Clower told a story about, it was Zig Ziglar. He was talking about objections to cost. And he said he went to the dentist. He had a bad tooth. And the dentist went in, put him in the chair. It took about 10 minutes, and it was $300. And this would have been 30 years ago. He said, "You mean you worked 10 minutes and you charged me $300?" He said, "How can you do that?" He said, "Well, I could take longer if you wanted me to. You know, I thought you wanted the problem solved."
Yeah.
And that is true. People want their problem solved. They want their pain level brought down.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, let me say it like this: when you're operating effectively in your calling, you're reducing somebody's pain.
100%.
You know, you're making their life better in some form or fashion. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. I hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of 2 Corinthians.